Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, young people, I'm glad to see you here. I hope that our debate encourages you to take an even greater interest in the public affairs which you read about in our newspapers and watch on television. And also, I hope this debate may actually inspire some of you to enter journalism, because at its best, journalism should be a noble profession and help enlighten society. It's also an immense pleasure for me to be speaking in this beautiful venue. I've had the opportunity to speak to journalism students and at conferences around the world, but I have never been in such a magnificent little jewel house and surrounded by friends and colleagues. So it's a great personal pleasure for me to be here with you today. As Massimo explained, from 1990 until 2000, prior to, during, and after the first Gulf War, I spent almost 10 years in Baghdad, but after accepting your gracious invitation to speak here about the subject of oil and Iraq, I consulted with the last acting U.S. ambassador to Iraq before the first Gulf War, Joseph Wilson, as well as several colleagues who covered the second Gulf War and are still in Baghdad today. You may remember Ambassador Wilson. He was the man who wrote an article in the New York Times claiming that Iraq did not import uranium from Niger, contrary to what President Bush said, and as a consequence of his opposition to Bush's policy of war, Ambassador Wilson, once considered an American hero, became an enemy of the state, and his wife, Valerie Plame, who worked for the CIA, was denounced, outed, and her identity made public, her career ruined, and their lives changed forever. Naturally, I have my own views about the war and oil, and I'm happy to share them with you later. But I think it's really important and useful for all of us to remember what the German politician von Bismarck said long ago about politics and history. He said, "Those who want to learn about these subjects by themselves are foolish, indeed idiots. Those who seek to learn from others are wise." Now, President George W. Bush is an idiot for many reasons, and his war against Iraq is probably the greatest foreign policy blunder in the history of the United States. He, along with Vice President Cheney, Secretary Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, are proof that Bismarck was correct. Instead of learning from his father, first President Bush, the current president abandoned the lessons of history and tried to formulate policy in a vacuum. And the result has been a disaster for both the Iraqi people and the United States in terms of lives lost, money wasted, opportunities squandered, and the prestige and reputation of the United States at its lowest point around the globe. not to mention an American economy in shambles and gasoline at the pumps in the United States now costing more than $4 a gallon, a price not unusual here in Europe, where you've been paying a lot for gasoline, but a price which has become a virtual shock to the American consumer, who was always used to cheap gasoline. Even though Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 was a clear violation of international law, I still believe today what I believed back then, that the first Gulf War could have been avoided through serious negotiations. But was that war really about oil? At the time of the invasion, the United States feared Iraq intended to move from Kuwait to Saudi Arabia, which of course posed a major strategic challenge to Washington and perhaps the globe if Iraq did in fact gain control of Saudi Arabia's oil fields. But when it became clear Saddam Hussein had no such intentions, Washington still prepared for war. And even though many protesters felt at the time the war was simply about oil, Ambassador Wilson maintains a different view. The first Gulf War, he told me, before coming to Italy, was not about oil per se, or even restoring democracy to Kuwait, since Kuwait was hardly a democracy to begin with. Wilson says that the war was about reversing an illegal invasion of a sovereign nation in violation of the United Nations Charter. And after sovereignty was in fact restored, U.S. policy focused on political openings in Kuwait, and indeed some small progress in terms of more equal rights for women, for example, have been made. Still, Wilson admits that even though that war was not technically about oil, it's pretty clear had Senegal invaded and swallowed Gambia, where the only exports are peanuts, it's highly doubtful the United States would have mobilized General Norman Schwarzkopf and 500,000 U.S. troops to push the Senegalese out.